These are your fast facts on 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Part 1. First, Corinth is probably the most flawed church that we know of in the New Testament. Based on Paul's extensive correspondence with the church at Corinth, the longest-running correspondence that we know of in the New Testament, we can get a pretty clear picture of just how close this church was to the brink. They bragged about an incestuous church member, they welcomed false teachers, and they rejected the Apostle Paul's later visit. You can see Paul's broken heart for this broken church all throughout these two letters. Second, Paul's visit to Corinth is archaeologically significant. Paul's extensive stay in Corinth, 1.5 years, ended with a trip to a place of judgment, Acts 18:12. This particular judgment or bema seat has been unearthed and provides striking present-day visual testimony to the flesh and blood ministry of Paul in this place. Third, Paul's visit and writings to Corinth are biographically significant. Acts 18:12 also tells us that Paul's stay there occurred during Gallio's proconsulship. Thanks to Luke's use of the proper name and due to surviving records of Gallio's limited term in that office, we can pin down the ministry of Paul in that city to a very specific period, around AD 52, also providing us with a clear sense of when the Corinthian letters were written. 1 Corinthians, then, was likely written while Paul was in Ephesus, about 3 or 4 years after the events of Acts 18 in AD 55. We see this in how the sending of Timothy from Ephesus in 1 Corinthians 4:17 aligns with the sending of Timothy in Acts 19:22. 2 Corinthians was likely written from Macedonia, maybe Philippi, shortly thereafter in AD 56. Fingerprints of a Macedonian location for the writing of 2 Corinthians are all over the letter. All of these events help us understand the timing of the Corinthian letters as well as the biography of Paul. Fourth, Corinth was messed up, but probably had a better reputation than what you've heard. There's an urban legend that the word Corinth had been turned into a verb, Corinthianized, which apparently was slang for various forms of illicit sexual activity. Although this was probably true at some point, the city had changed and grown significantly since the time of any records of this kind of nomenclature. We should be cautious not to let anachronistic assumptions overlay or color our understanding of Corinth. Fifth, Corinth had a distinct worldview and unique baggage. What we know of Corinth's spiritual situation is addressed to some degree throughout the two letters to its church. We know they were obsessed with power and prestige of people that they saw as significant, particularly men with impressive public speaking gifts. After Paul left town, false teachers capitalized on this obsession, and even Orthodox teachers unintentionally caused a degree of fragmentation among the church there in Corinth. Sixth, the situation in Corinth was complex. Paul doesn't address vanilla brand Judaism or full Gnosticism here. Instead, he addresses issues that arose due to the particular Corinthian worldview. Here are a few noteworthy features. Division. The church was divided against itself. Heresy. It started external in 1 Corinthians and moved internal in 2 Corinthians. And of course, #blessed. They believed that the kingdom and all of its benefits had fully arrived spiritually. And of course, many other features as well. Seventh, our 2 Corinthian letters are only 2 of 4 total letters from Paul, plus another 2 or 3 visits. A likely reconstruction of these letters is as follows. First, you have visit 1. That's recorded for us in Acts 18. About 1.5 years there in Acts 18, verse 11, where Paul founded the church. Then you have about a 3 to 4 year gap, followed by, let's call it letter A, which is described in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. Then comes letter B, which we know as 1 Corinthians. After letter B is written, factions begin to arise. This is described in 2 Corinthians 11:13. Then there's visit number 2, which Paul describes as painful in 2 Corinthians 2:1. After that second visit, letter C is written, which is a severe letter according to 2 Corinthians 2, 3-4, and chapter 7, 8, and 9. Then there's an update that comes to Paul, according to 2 Corinthians 2:13, after which letter D is written, which we know as 2 Corinthians, and that comes from Macedonia, perhaps Philippi. After 2 Corinthians is written, a third visit likely occurs in Acts 20, 2-3. Thus, our surviving letters are letters B and D of at least 4 total letters to Corinth. Eighth, theories about the structure of 2 Corinthians abound. Although our copies of 2 Corinthians are in the present form, a single, undivided book, the stop and start nature of the book has led many scholars throughout the years to suggest various ways to consider the composition of the book in order to account for the changes throughout the book. One, some would say 2 Corinthians 1-13 is all letter D, composed in a very narrow window of time addressing the same circumstances throughout. Second, some would say 2 Corinthians Corinthians 1 through 13 is all letter D, but composed over a wider span of time, addressing one circumstance in chapters 1 through 9, and then a changed circumstance in chapters 10 through 13. The third view is that 2 Corinthians is actually two letters. Letter D, as we described earlier, is chapters 1 through 9, and letter C, the severe letter that we described earlier, is actually chapters 10 through 13. The fourth view is that 2 Corinthians is also two letters, but is letter D in chapters 1 through 9, and then a later letter that wasn't in our previous list, letter E, in chapters 10 through 13. Although each of these views has its own strengths, the second view seems to have the most to commend it in my perspective. Ninth, the Corinthian letters cover a broad range of important topics. The Corinthian letters add much to our understanding of many important theological and practical matters such as marriage, divorce, and celibacy in 1 Corinthians 7, Christian freedom in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, men, women, spiritual gifts, and order in the church in 1 Corinthians 11 to 14, the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, giving in 1 Corinthians 9, 16, and 2 Corinthians 9, and suffering, 2 Corinthians 1, 4, 6, 7, 11, 12, and 13. And those are your fast facts on 1 and 2 Corinthians.